Next, on American History TV, military historian Paul Springer talks about the use of cutting-edge technology in the United States military. He argues that the advancement of robotic weaponry in warfare, such as drones and artificial intelligence, have revolutionized military affairs, making previous tactics obsolete. The New York Historical Society hosted this 90-minute event.
Now, it's a pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Paul Springer, who is a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, but also from his day job at the Air Command and Staff College in Alabama. He also taught at West Point. He's the author of many books and many coming out on cyber war, military robotics, the history of prisoners of war, and a load of other topics. He's been on CNN, NPR, Fox, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, the National Geographic Channel, and he's really one of our most popular lecturers. Today we've asked him to speak on the revolutions in military affairs, which will give you a quick survey of military history from the 13th century all the way up to today, all in an hour, so I'm sure you will enjoy. Please welcome Paul Springer.
Good morning. I'd like to extend a thank you to Dale and Alan, the New York Historical Society and the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Both are wonderful organizations that I support and I love working with, and it's a great opportunity to come and speak to all of you today. So we'll see if I can leave you terrified for the rest of the weekend with some military robotics information for you here. But I'm a historian, and by definition that means I have to back up way too far to tell you the very beginning of the story. Before I really get rolling, because I work for the Air Force, don't worry about reading the small disclaimer at the bottom there. These are my views. These are not the views of the Air Force. These are not the views of the Department of Defense. These are not the views of the U.S. government. They are solely mine, unless you really like them, in which case everybody else can take credit too. All right. So this is the only slide I'm going to throw at you that has an enormous amount of text, and once again, I don't actually expect you to read it, nor am I going to read it to you. But the point to this entire lecture, if you walk away with nothing else, my fundamental argument is that the world right now is in the middle of what's called a revolution in military affairs. That means the mode of human conflict is fundamentally altering. And that fundamental alteration is going to change virtually every aspect of the ways that human conflicts are propagated. It's going to change how we decide whether or not to go to war, and it's going to change how we behave when we find ourselves in a war. And this is all due to technological changes that are really on the verge of upsetting all of human society. In the end, there will be some countries that adopt to the changes, that take the new technology and learn how to utilize it, and there will be some that don't. These will be the haves and the have-nots of the future when it comes to conflict. There is an enormous advantage to being one of the first adopters. If you have a revolutionary change in the way that conflict is occurring, it becomes possible to dominate your rivals in a very short period of time. Now, the originator of the term revolution in military affairs was Nikolai Orgarkov. I am a product of the Cold War, so it slightly pains me to give credit to a Soviet thinker, but he had a really great idea. And his idea was that there are times where fundamental changes occur, and they occur so rapidly that they essentially make everything that has gone before completely obsolete. It is my contention that that is occurring right now before our very eyes. Let me give you an example that people are probably more familiar with. If you go back to the Middle Ages, this is what characterized war: castles and moats and heavily armored knights. And if you wanted to capture something belonging to an opponent, that was an undertaking that was likely to take you months of siegecraft, unless you were somehow lucky enough to find them with the gates conveniently open, the walls unmanned, the moat drained, and no preparations made. Now up here we have three successful sieges in the 14th and 15th century, and as you can see, each one of those was a major undertaking that really required all of the resources and all of the time of an entire campaign season. And this is what characterized war in that time period. However, when gunpowder became the norm in Europe, the situation fundamentally changed. It suddenly became possible to batter down the defenses of a tall, high-walled castle from a safe distance. And the attacker had the advantage, because after all, the castle and its defenders could not leave their position, while the attackers had a certain degree of mobility, could choose where to fight, could choose when to fight. And suddenly, being inside a castle was a disadvantage because you became an obvious target. As a result, here are some successful sieges, and you'll notice we're still in the 15th century, but the siege duration is suddenly measured in days, rather than being a multi-month undertaking with no guarantee of success. But the situation didn't remain stable. Gunpowder had certainly changed the approach to warfare, but it also was possible to redesign your fortifications, to make them less vulnerable to gunfire, and thus it became possible to once again defend a static position. This is what one of those fortifications looked like in the 1600s. As you can see, it is an enormous fortification full of geometric designs. The idea behind this particular fort was that it could not be approached on any side without the attackers coming under heavy fire from multiple angles from the defenders. The result? We're back up to really long sieges. And these are the sieges that actually succeeded. The vast majority of siege attempts in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were doomed to failure. It became once again a major undertaking, and warfare shifted back to a positional, static approach. But as you might imagine, those who had not adopted gunpowder, who had not changed to meet the new situation, found themselves quickly overwhelmed. It became impossible for an army that did not use gunpowder to withstand one that wielded firearms. If siegecraft became almost impossible, it guaranteed that you were going to have some battles fought away from static positions. Sometimes you just could not build a fortification in a place that you wanted to defend long term. And sometimes armies were going to meet in the field. Now, in the 16th century, reloading a firearm could take approximately 2 minutes. And the effective range of a firearm was only about 50 meters. Now, I am not exactly, shall we say, a paragon of physical fitness. But even I can cross 50 meters in under 2 minutes. I can crawl 50 meters in under 2 minutes. Which means if you're using firearms and you shoot and miss, there is a reasonable chance that I am going to run across the field and hit you with something really sharp or something really heavy. As a result, we get mixed formations. This is the Spanish tercio. It comprises musketeers on the outsides and pikemen in the center. The musketeers open fire. After they shoot, the pikemen come to the outside to protect them while they reload. This made it impossible for a cavalry charge to overwhelm a group of musketeers in a matter of a few seconds. It was very unwieldy, moved very slow, and it swept everything before it on the battlefield because it was infinitely better than anything else that someone had come up with to that time to use firearms in the field. And it teaches us something. It teaches us that sometimes it's not the technology that matters, it's being the first one that figures out how to utilize it effectively. And that's what's going on here. The Spanish wind up using the tercio to become the dominant land power in Europe. But nothing lasts forever. Now, this is one of the rare times where you're going to hear a historian talk to you about Swedish military dominance. It's not really what they're particularly known for. But it was the Swedes that figured out how to actually counter the tercio. They realized it was very unwieldy because everybody was getting in each other's way. It was hard to move around. You could have thousands of troops all within the hearing of one person who's screaming to be heard over the sound of them moving around. And maybe the pikes could protect the musketeers without standing amongst the musketeers. The idea was called the brigade. And when the brigade swept onto the battlefields of Europe under Gustavus Adolphus, it drove the tercios from the field. Gustavus Adolphus entered the 30 Years' War knowing that it was one of enormous carnage, but he had this new idea that for a brief period allowed the Swedes to turn the tide of a war that had effectively engulfed the entire European continent. And this thing was a bloody mess. As much as 25% of the European population died in that war, a much higher percentage than died during World War II. So this tells us that these new forms of weaponry, even though they seem very archaic to us today, could be extremely effective when used en masse. If we fast forward a few centuries, we reach World War I. Once again, gunpowder is the dominant weapon of the era. The difference now, of course, each individual wielding a machine gun like this can fire 600 rounds per minute. And they can sustain that rate of fire as long as they have bullets. And they can fire relatively accurately for a distance of up to 2 miles. I cannot cross 2 miles in under 2 minutes. There's no way I'm going to be able to do it with a couple thousand bullets flying at me. And this caused warfare to once again become very static, to become very position-oriented, to, for all intents and purposes, stagnate. But progress continues. Now, World War I, at the time, was the bloodiest war in history. Millions of people died. And there was a significant movement around the world to say, oh, well, we're never going to do that again. At one point, leading nations attempted to ban the practice of warfare, which did not last very long, though technically the United States has never actually repealed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is where we swore that we wouldn't use warfare as an instrument of policy. There were other attempts to try to mitigate the worst aspects of warfare, a lot of which came out as a result of this gunpowder revolution. So you had very prominent thinkers in the 17th and 18th centuries that effectively said, there are limits to what you can do in warfare. There are things that are not acceptable behavior. For example, you shouldn't go out and poison your bullets before firing them at someone. You shouldn't deliberately kill someone after you have captured them. You shouldn't deliberately spread disease amongst your enemies. Yes, they're your enemies, but when wars end, you have to go back to at least being able to coexist, unless your objective is the complete and utter annihilation of your opponent, which these thinkers would also tell you flat wrong. You shouldn't do that. Annihilation is bad. So even though we're innovating these new technological ideas, we're building these new concepts, at the same time we're saying there's some things you just don't do. You don't invent weapons that are designed to maim. You accept the enemy's surrender if they offer it in good faith. And over time, it becomes the norm in European warfare that there are specific limits. Now, these thinkers also consider, when is it acceptable to go to war? And they come to the conclusion that there are times that warfare is an acceptable policy option. Obviously, you have the right to go to war to defend yourself, to defend your citizenry, to defend your territory. But there are other circumstances in which warfare is also an acceptable alternative to these thinkers. Now, as we move forward into the 20th century, after World War II, there was a significant movement once again to never allow a conflict like that to happen. And when the United Nations Charter was written, a key component of the Charter was that member states of the United Nations shall not make war upon one another. If you violate that norm, the expectation is that all of the other member states will come to the aid of the victim. As you all know, it hasn't always worked out that way in practice. But there is an enormous body of international law governing what you can and cannot do in war. Most of it is encapsulated in the Geneva Conventions. There are 4 key components that are going to matter a little bit later in the lecture as to what are the ultimate limits of warfare in terms of who can and cannot participate. And the Geneva Conventions make those clear. Number 1, you must bear arms openly. You're not allowed to make war by hiding your weaponry, pulling it out, attacking the enemy, hiding it again. 2, you must wear some form of uniform or recognizable device. It may be the uniform of a country with a flag on it. It may be something as simple as the green headscarves common to Hamas. But it has to be something recognizable and distinct so that I know you are representing yourself as a combatant and you are expecting me to follow the rules of war. Third, you must be part of an organization with a hierarchical structure where the leadership is responsible for the behavior of subordinates. So there has to be some form of command and control, someone that can be ultimately held responsible for the behavior of troops in the field. And fourth, you must follow the laws of war. If you don't follow the laws of war, you cannot claim their protections in any form of combat. Now, why does this matter? Well, the United States is currently engaged in a fight. We're fighting the Islamic State. We're fighting Al-Qaeda. We're fighting terrorism as a concept. And the organizations with which we are in conflict do not bear arms openly, do not wear a recognizable uniform, do not have a command structure where the leadership is held accountable for the behavior of subordinates, and they certainly do not follow the laws of war. So they're outside of our traditional understanding of who is an acceptable combatant and who is protected by the laws of war. And if the United States and its allies choose to extend additional privileges, such as accepting surrenders, such as restraining ourselves, that is our option. But we really effectively have to follow the rules of war, even though we're facing an enemy that doesn't. And that could be an incredibly frustrating situation, as this cartoon illustrates. We have to follow the laws of war for one fundamental reason. If we don't follow the laws of war, then the laws of war themselves become largely irrelevant. And the enemy that we are currently facing has its primary goal the destruction of the existing world order. You can conceive of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda as a global insurgency. Its goal is not necessarily just to bring down individual governments. Its goal is to destroy the entire international system. It's trying to pull down this system that we have with the United Nations, where there are nations that are considered haves and nations that are considered have-nots, and none of the haves resemble the organizations that are pushing to bring it down. Consider, the permanent members of the UN Security Council have the ultimate international relations tool, a veto over UN use of violence. And those nations are the United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China. None of them are Muslim. None of them are in the Middle Eastern region. So imagine, if you will, if we were to redesign the Permanent Security Council, if we were to choose new membership, would you put the same 5 countries in there? Not on the basis of economics, you wouldn't. Not on the basis of population size. Probably not on the basis of geography. Now imagine the Islamic State achieves everything that it claims to be pushing for. It creates a pan-Islamic caliphate that stretches from North Africa all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Would they have cause to claim membership in this most elite of fraternities? They might. Or they might instead choose to simply pull down the system because they believe that chaos and anarchy will more effectively serve their end goals. So that's our starting point here. Now, when it comes to 21st century conflict and military robotics, which is the heart of what I want to discuss for you today, I need to establish a few definitions for you first. The media is a big fan of the term drone. And drone has a specific meaning. A drone is a pre-programmed machine. It does whatever it's told to do. It doesn't think. It doesn't react to its environment. It doesn't choose from a host of different options. It simply does what it's told. You pre-program a route, it flies the route. You tell it to strike a certain point, it strikes a certain point. It's not a thinking machine. And a drone, by definition, is not being driven by some other intelligence. You fire a cruise missile, it flies off. You don't control it on its route. You might have the ability to stop it, to abort its mission, but there's no intelligence guiding its actions. It's already been done. A robotic system incorporates some degree of the ability to sense an environment and make decisions on the basis of it. So, for example, you're probably familiar with a predator. A predator is being flown by a human operator, but it has some functions that it performs automatically on its own, which makes flying the system a lot easier. It does not choose to kill. A human being chooses to fire a missile from a predator. It does not choose where it will fly. A human being chooses where it will fly. But it does some things on its own. Some of these other devices here, this is called a packbot. It has become most well known as an explosive ordnance disposal robot. It allows you to avoid putting humans in the worst of harm's way. It does not disarm bombs on its own. It gets close to the bomb and then does what its operator tells it to do. Incredibly useful if you're trying to reduce your casualties, because at the end of the day, nobody cries if a robot dies. After all, the robot doesn't die. It just gets rendered into smaller pieces. On the right, this is a little more terrifying. This is the packbot's larger, uglier cousin. It's called a Talon. It weighs about 200 pounds. It is remotely driven. This thing is not driving itself around and shooting off guns and causing chaos everywhere it goes. There is an operator that is driving it from a distance using a camera. But as you can see, this thing can be armed. You can put rocket launchers, you can put grenade launchers, you can put machine guns on it. And it doesn't suffer from a lot of the problems that trigger inaccuracy in humans while using weaponry. It doesn't have a pulse. It doesn't breathe. It instantly calculates the wind. It has a laser rangefinder. It doesn't care what it's shooting at. It doesn't feel bad if it's shooting at a house full of children. It just does what it's told. Now, there's a human operator telling it to do that, but that means there's a certain divorce here. The human is a little further away from the intimacy of killing. A true robot. As you can see, I've used a lot of pop culture references here. And the reason why is, for all intents and purposes, robots don't exist yet. Not in the way that the military means when it uses the term robot. A robot senses its environment and it makes decisions of what it's going to do on the basis of the environment it senses. And right now, there are no weapons that are true robots in the classical sense, wandering around and causing headaches for everyone. They don't exist yet. But they are on the immediate horizon. And I'm going to show you some examples of how close we're getting and what we could do if we chose to when it comes to fielding this type of device. Final definition, a cyborg. That is a cybernetic organism. That is a human, or any other kind of critter, but usually a human, that has actually incorporated robotic elements into themselves, usually as a form of enhancement. Rush Limbaugh, whether you know it or not, is a cyborg. He actually has an implant in his ear that has restored hearing to him, without which he's completely deaf, which, as I understand it, is a problem for a radio host. There are other cyborgs out there, and we'll see a few of them a little further down the road. You may be surprised some of the things that we can do now with mind-controlled implants. Artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is the notion that you could create a machine that would be capable of processing information in the same fashion as a human. To a certain extent, artificial intelligence is a red herring. There's not a particularly compelling reason to create something that's artificially intelligent. Robots give us the advantage that we can choose specializations. We can design them. There's not a particularly compelling reason to produce a humanoid robot with all of the frailties and weaknesses of human beings. To be honest, if I was designing the next human being, this is not the shape I would choose. If I was designing this human being, this isn't the shape I would choose either. So I'm a very picky guy, apparently. Now, Alan Turing, right here, was a British cryptanalyst during World War II. He posited the idea of what is called now the Turing test. Turing's idea was, if you could query a computer and a human being through some mechanism where the sound of it would not tell you which was which, so whether you were maybe using a keyboard to ask it questions, you could determine whether you had created artificial intelligence by having a human being question the machine and other humans, and if they couldn't determine which was which, you would have created artificial intelligence, according to Turing. Now, Microsoft, a few weeks ago, thought, let's run a little experiment. They created an artificial intelligence, and what they did was they created a Twitter account and turned it over to a computer. And hypothetically, they programmed this computer to act the way that Microsoft thinks a 15-year-old girl would act on a Twitter account. Within 24 hours, this thing was tweeting racist responses. Essentially, it had been trained by the internet in all of the horrific things that the internet can bring to life. And Microsoft quickly shut it down and said, oh, okay, all right. Didn't know 15-year-old girls were quite that racist. Okay, let's try again. About a week later, they brought it back out again. This time it took less than 6 hours before it was announcing Hitler was right. So Microsoft shut that down. Maybe they'll rethink that a little bit. However, there have been other companies that have done better. Maybe you're familiar with the machine called Watson. This was a computer that was designed to play Jeopardy against human opponents. And playing Jeopardy requires a lot more than just an enormous knowledge of trivia, because most of the questions are written in such a way that they require abstract reasoning. They require you to think through in ways that, previous to now, only humans could do. Watson won the game against the best Jeopardy champion that had ever played. And this came as a major shock to us. Now we had a machine that appeared to be capable of very quickly reasoning through very challenging questions. But what do you do with a machine like that? What's the practical use of something like Watson? It turns out the thing is phenomenally helpful in the medical field. Watson has been built by IBM and copies of it turned over to some major medical centers. And what we're finding is this machine can read virtually every medical research item that has ever been produced in every language. And as a result, it's able to make conclusions that would never occur to a human doctor. So your left big toe itches and you taste peanut butter in the roof of your mouth. You have liver cancer. That's a made-up example. But Watson takes these strange symptoms, puts them together, and then spits out what it thinks is the most likely answer. And what it's doing is it's actually looking in very obscure medical journals for the individual strange cases that get written up by doctors that often resulted in the death of a patient. They did an autopsy and said, oh, itchy big toe and peanut butter in the top of their mouth. Clearly that was liver cancer, it turns out. Watson is doing that, and it's doing it in real time. This offers the possibility to revolutionize our approach to medicine. And that's great. That could be a wonderful innovation. We're going to see some dark sides coming up for us in just a moment as well, though. Now, when it comes to military robotics and artificial intelligence, there are some things that machines do infinitely better than humans do. Feel free to run a race with just a basic calculator and see whether you're faster than it is on arithmetic. You won't be. It's hyper-specialized, but it's a fairly simple process. It is a far harder process to do things like immediate calculations of ballistic tables and determinations of whether or not to engage what might be a threat. And that's what these devices are down here at the bottom. You may be familiar with the Patriot missile system. It's an air defense system. You may not know that it has a fully autonomous mode. You flip the switch, and it will fire on anything coming into its engagement zone that it perceives as a threat. So hopefully you have correctly predefined what it should consider a threat. Unfortunately, on a number of occasions, Patriot missile batteries have opened up on coalition aircraft fighting on the same side as the United States, and on at least 2 occasions they have opened fire on American military aircraft, despite the fact that those American aircraft were actually using a transponder code that should have told it, do not shoot at me, I'm an American. So the systems don't always work perfectly. But when it comes to something like air defense, sometimes you have to accept the possibility of failure because it's too dangerous not to turn on the system. In the center here, this is called a close-in weapons system. It is effectively a radar-guided, very, very powerful machine gun. It is used as the last line of defense on American naval vessels and has been used as such for more than 30 years. If somebody shoots a missile at one of our ships, last chance to shoot that missile down before it hits our ship and potentially sinks it. It might kill thousands of lives if it strikes an aircraft carrier. You're willing to use this in fully autonomous mode because it's your last chance to save lots of lives, and you're using it over the ocean, so the possibility of collateral damage is relatively low. In this regard, autonomy is your best chance to actually save the sailors, and so it's perfectly acceptable to use this in an autonomous mode. It's not as acceptable to use autonomous weapons in other circumstances, where collateral damage is infinitely more likely. Just as you're willing to use this out on the open ocean, you're probably not willing to use this in the middle of New York City. Because you can only imagine what happens to every round that misses the missile. And this thing can fire 6,000 rounds a minute. That is an awful lot of projectiles flying through the air. Now, when it comes to computerized warfare, we've seen some fundamental innovations and changes. In case you hadn't heard, Israel doesn't always get along well with its neighbors. Israel does not like the idea of any of its neighbors obtaining nuclear weapons. In 1981, the Israelis got word that the Iraqis had built a nuclear reactor and were in the process of enriching uranium towards the pursuit of nuclear weapons. The Israelis refused to tolerate that. They quietly worked out a deal with the Saudis that allowed them to fly over Saudi airspace, and they attacked and destroyed the reactor at Osirak. This, for all intents and purposes, ended the Iraqi nuclear program. It made it clear that the Israelis would launch an airstrike any time the Iraqis were close to achieving a weapons capability. In 2007, the Israelis got wind that the Syrians had built a nuclear program. They were using North Korean and Pakistani expertise in order to get this thing up and rolling. They didn't want to tolerate a nuclear program with a hostile neighbor, but the Syrians had also purchased a first-rate air defense system. And the Israelis were not confident that their aircraft could penetrate Syrian airspace, attack the heavily fortified location, and retreat back to Israel without paying an enormous cost. So, the Israelis inserted a commando team that went in on the ground in Syria, managed to dig up a portion of the Syrian fiber optic network controlling the radar sites that controlled their air defense network, and they uploaded a virus. And that virus caused the radars to be convinced that there was nothing to see. It was just a nice placid night. The first hint that the Syrians had that they were under attack was the explosions striking the nuclear program and essentially wiping it out. This is what cyber had enabled the Israelis to do. It worked with their kinetic platforms to destroy a major threat. But if we fast forward just a few years, you may have heard of Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a virus that required, at the minimum, the resources of a nation in order to potentially create it. It used an incredibly sophisticated system in order to effectively seek out a very specific type of machine. And that machine powers centrifuges. Centrifuges that are used to separate uranium. Somebody, and nobody has taken credit for it yet, but the leading candidates are the United States and Israel. I'm not revealing any classified information. I don't have a clue whether it was the United States or Israel, but they're the most likely candidates because it was an Iranian nuclear facility that had us so nervous. Somebody wandered around the parking lot of that facility and dropped a couple of thumb drives. Just dropped a couple of flash drives. And somebody else came along and went, flash drive. Oh, I bet somebody's going to want that back. So they picked it up, they walked inside, they plugged it into a computer. Try to figure out who it belonged to so they could give it back. And the moment they did that, they uploaded Stuxnet into their otherwise divorced from the internet system. Stuxnet then searched out the logic controllers for those centrifuges, and it made a tiny change in their programming. And that tiny change caused the centrifuges to spin up and spin down. Spin up and spin down. It induced just enough of a vibration to cause the centrifuges to start to fail. The Iranians weren't sure what was going on. They didn't know they were the victim of a cyber attack. They thought maybe this just indicated that they were incompetent at building centrifuges. Maybe this meant that they didn't have the know-how necessary to create a nuclear program. It really started to erode their confidence, started to weaken their belief in what they were doing. It wasn't until a couple years later when a small Belarusian antivirus firm located and pointed out the existence of Stuxnet that we even knew what had caused the Iranian centrifuges to fail. But without using a single warplane, without committing a single act of war, somebody shut down the Iranian nuclear program for about 3 years. At about the same time, somebody, and it may have been the same somebody, I don't know, started assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists. That was a little bit more overt. You know, a computer virus is one thing. Shooting people is a little more obvious what you're up to. And again, I don't know who was responsible for that. I just know there's an awful lot of people that are not excited about the idea of an Iranian nuclear program. And here we have this technology enabling the possibility of shutting it down without having to do the classic attack that would be characterized as an act of war. Now, when it comes to military robotics, this is a much longer thing than most people realize. Military robotics are not new. You can go back almost 100 years to have a very rudimentary system, the Kettering bug, also known as a flying torpedo. It's basically an airplane packed full of explosives that is designed to have its engine shut off after a certain period of flight, which will cause it to just dive on whatever target is beneath it. This was innovated by Charles Kettering. It was never actually fielded in time for World War I, which is probably a good thing. It didn't work very well. It wasn't very dependable. It was just as likely to come down on your own forces as it was on the enemy. But if we move forward a little bit, getting on the verge of World War II, the Soviets came up with what they called the teletank. This was a remotely driven tank. Everything about the tank was normal, except it had no human beings inside of it. The human beings that controlled it sat in another tank a couple miles away and controlled it via radio signals that they sent through line of sight. It didn't work very well. It was rather clunky. The vast majority of their teletanks they had to destroy themselves when the Finnish people that they were fighting against realized they could just climb up on top of the teletank, go down inside, pull out the radio controls, and hey, I got a new tank. A brand new tank just for me. So the Soviets wind up destroying some of their own stuff. The Germans, they're going to create the Goliath. This is a 200-pound, wire-driven, little miniature tracked vehicle designed to be driven underneath enemy tanks and detonated. Think of it like a landmine that moves around. Its big vulnerability, it's wire-guided. You cut the wire, it doesn't move anymore. The vast majority of their Goliaths wound up just being stockpiled and never used. And finally, the V-1 flying bomb, the buzz bombs. These things proved to be fairly effective. Much like the Kettering bug, what you have is an airplane engine, in this case a jet, attached to a bomb. You launch it, and you hope. You can target a city the size of London and have a reasonable chance of hitting that city. You cannot target a specific address and have any chance other than dumb luck of hitting it. But a city the size of London with millions of inhabitants suddenly faces a bombardment for which they initially have no real response. When the British try to shoot down these particular items, they discover they're a lot harder to shoot down than you would think. They wind up finding out the easiest way to take down a V-1 is actually to fly up next to it, put your wingtip underneath its wingtip, and tip it over. And if you do that, that will cause it to crash. Not the safest of activities, though. Not the best idea for how to spend a Sunday afternoon. Okay, moving forward into at least my lifetime. The Pioneer, this thing was usually used for artillery spotting in the 1980s. In particular, the Navy liked to use it since they fire projectiles 20 or more miles into the distance. They could fly this thing overhead, look down, and tell them how to adjust their fire. Pretty effective, pretty easy to use. This is a target drone from the Vietnam era. Somebody came up with the brilliant idea that you could put a television camera on it, fly it over hostile space, and now no longer have to use human pilots on reconnaissance missions. Then we started flying these things over China. Since China was intervening in the Vietnam War, we wanted to see what they were up to and get a little advance warning. The Chinese start shooting them down. And as they shoot them down, they run out to the wreckage and they can't figure out why they can never capture a pilot. Apparently, American pilots are really good at hide and seek. It's because there is no pilot. But there are an awful lot of these things on display in Chinese military museums that they point to as American fighter aircraft that they shot down. This is Kevin Warwick. Kevin Warwick is a British researcher, and in my opinion, an incredibly creepy guy. He's very smart. So Kevin comes up with this idea. He says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get a microchip implanted in my wrist, and I'm going to use that microchip to measure the electrical impulses of the human nervous system, to figure out at what frequency and at what amperage, how does the human body actually control itself. And after a long medical study, they decided, okay, well, we can let him do it to himself. So he has it surgically implanted. He figures out which nerves in his wrist control which muscles in his hand. He then maps it to an artificial hand, which he is then able to control with his mind. He closes his hand into a fist, it closes into a fist. He opens it up, it opens up. Revolutionary, pioneering, a mind-controlled prosthetic 16 years ago. That's not creepy, that's kind of neat. Creepy is when Kevin's wife has a similar microchip implanted into her wrist, and they are now able to control each other's hands. Able to control each other's hands with their own minds. And that was almost 2 decades ago. So you can imagine where this is going. Getting close to the modern era here. The Reaper is a much larger, well, it's actually almost the same size as a Predator, but much more powerful version of the Predator. Instead of carrying 2 missiles, it can carry up to 14. This man right here has a cybernetic hand, which is controlled by his mind. It has since been implanted onto his arm. He is capable of picking up an egg with one hand, not his human hand, and cracking it. I can't do that. I have 2 perfectly good hands, make a mess every time I try. But this guy has such good fine motor control, and it has a force feedback system, which means he can close his eyes and tell you when he's touching something and what it feels like. All through the signals going back to his mind. The Israelis took our Patriot missile system and built Iron Dome, a much larger, much more sophisticated system that is capable of tracking inbound projectiles, rockets, and missiles, and choosing whether or not to shoot them down. It doesn't just engage everything that flies overhead. Instead, it calculates where is that thing going to come down? Is it a populated area, in which case I should intercept? Or is it an unpopulated area, in which case I should let it just fly off into the middle of nowhere? Let it strike where it's going to be perfectly safe. This has massively reduced the number of casualties that the Israelis are facing from rockets being fired out of the Gaza and out of the northern regions from southern Lebanon. Big Dog, this is from Boston Dynamics. This company essentially has built a robotic mule. It can carry 300 pounds of gear. It can move at the same speed as a human on foot. It can move up slopes of up to 30 degrees, which I assure you is a very high slope. It can walk on ice. It can follow, basically it can be programmed to follow an individual human being, and it will just follow them wherever they go. The idea is American troops that are dismounted moving through urban areas tend to be loaded down with up to 100 pounds of gear. It would be incredibly useful if they could offload that to some form of machine that they could assume would keep up with them. That's the idea. And then finally, the Atlas robot. The Atlas robot is designed to be able to go into dangerous locations. The first time we actually saw this thing in operation, it was sent into the Fukushima reactor in Japan to see whether there was a reactor leak underway. Now that wound up destroying the robot, but that's a much better alternative than destroying a human. The radiation levels were so high that it would have killed anybody that went inside there to see what was going on. This machine is actually designed to be able to go where humans go. It's one of the rare cases where you actually want the machine to have roughly the same humanoid design, so that it could use theoretically the same types of vehicles and it could move in the same areas. Now, in case you're wondering, the CRAM, this is the land version of that close-in weapons system. We put this thing into bases in Iraq that were being shelled by artillery and mortar fire. It is capable of locating and engaging projectiles as small as 60 millimeters. So it can hit very small targets. Now, the DoD, we like to think of ourselves as environmentally friendly. We've actually made biodegradable projectiles for it. So when those projectiles come down, they're actually designed to do no collateral damage and not to harm the environment. So no more depleted uranium being thrown around. That's nice, right? It's because we care. Okay, where we're going. This man right here is quadriplegic, but he is wearing a mind-controlled exoskeleton that allows him to walk, allows him to move. It is a fairly slow system right now. He's not moving at normal human speeds. But it's a heck of a lot better than the alternative. This individual is wearing a leg that is controlled by his mind and allows him to move at regular walking speed. In both of those cases, the research was highly advanced thanks to all of the casualties we were taking from improvised explosive devices in Iraq. There are an awful lot of American service personnel that have lost a limb, and the DoD has put a lot of effort into trying to advance research into giving them a better quality of life. You've already seen the Talon swords. Here are a few of their variants. The direction we're going with those things is full autonomy. Rather than having a human being dedicated to driving them, you would instead have them moving along aside or in place of your human troops. And that starts to make me a little nervous, because you can program those things to engage human targets without human intervention. Nobody in the loop saying, yes, shoot, or no, don't shoot. You can equip them with effectively an audio detection system that picks up the sound of gunfire and automatically pivots to return fire. So if you have a problem with snipers in an urban area, you could deploy some of these. And if the sniper takes a shot, you have the ability to immediately shoot back on the sniper's position. On the one hand, this is a good thing. It reduces coalition casualties. On the other hand, it's not going to take very long before our opponents start chaining children in front of sniper positions. And this is a way that they are going to potentially take advantage of our ethics, our morality, and our superior technology. A few years ago, Hitachi came out with a facial recognition system. And that camera can compare up to 30 million faces in a minute. And it can do so at a high angle of profile. About 20 years ago, the U.S. Air Force came up with the low-cast system. This was designed to essentially fly over a battlefield, look for targets, and fire without human intervention. So I want you to take a moment to imagine what happens if you pair the Hitachi facial recognition system with the low-cast, fully autonomous loitering vehicle. You fire it, it loiters over a city for up to 4 hours, looking for the individuals whose pictures you've uploaded, and then it starts firing small missiles at them. When it runs out of missiles, it crashes itself as a final projectile in a kamikaze system. These are the things that are starting to keep me awake at night. Where we're going? Swarms. Swarms are all the rage. You can have very complex behavior out of very simple devices. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, a few years ago came out with what they call the Centibots. These are very small ground robots that have very simple programming. Number one, move around and look around. Number two, stay away from other robots. Number three, report back what you see. Simple programming. And they are capable of mapping a city the size of New York, every building, every street, with just 100 robots in a matter of about 2 weeks. And there's not a human being driving them. All they're doing is wandering around and mapping as they go. Now, this is assuming that they're not being run over by cabbies or kicked by angry New Yorkers, but the principle, if it was just an empty city, they could map it very quickly. The AeroVironment Switchblade is a fire-and-forget weapon. This is where we're going in terms of shooting and then not thinking about it anymore. And one of the problems for us is, who's responsible? If this thing makes a strike on a target that we would consider to be illegal, who do you blame? You can't punish a robot, or at least you can't punish it in any way that it will consider punishment, for violating the laws of war. You can't force a robot to feel bad about what it's done. In theory, you could punish the commander who released the weapon. You could punish whoever made the decision to ship it to the theater. You could punish whoever wrote the software for it. But the history of military prosecutions would indicate that's not going to happen. Even the perpetrator of the My Lai massacre, William Calley, who was ultimately responsible for the death of about 400 civilians, his punishment was 6 months of house arrest. So what are the chances we're going to hold somebody responsible if one of our machines malfunctions? And what are the chances that we're just going to write it off as a malfunction, an unfortunate situation? I am a pessimist, so I tend to think it's the latter. Now, I've got a final case study for you here, and this one's going to come from the news, and you're probably familiar with this individual. Anwar al-Awlaki. Not a pleasant individual. Awlaki was born in the United States, American citizen. He becomes radicalized. He winds up moving to Yemen, and he becomes essentially the spiritual leader of the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, an offshoot of the Al-Qaeda Central Command. He is over there doing his best to inspire attacks against the West, and he's being fairly successful. Some of his known associates include Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, the underwear bomber, and Faisal Shahzad, who tried to set off a bomb in Times Square. He was also associated with at least 3 of the 9/11 attackers, and a 15-year-old boy who tried to detonate a car bomb at a Christmas tree lighting ceremony in Portland, Oregon. Awlaki was a busy guy. He spent a lot of time recruiting individuals for what he saw as the quintessential fight against the West, against the United States. Awlaki's last few years of his life are spent in hiding. He's on the run. He's living in Yemen, and he knows that he's been placed on the United States designated targeted kill list. Effectively the list that's maintained by the Treasury Department, that is the kill or capture, but heavy emphasis on kill list. Awlaki, as a U.S. citizen, thinks that he ought to have constitutional protections, that he has effectively been judged and sentenced to execution without a criminal trial. His father sues in a federal court to get him taken off the list on the grounds that he is an American citizen and that he has not done anything that is technically against the law. It's a gray area whether or not what Awlaki did technically violated U.S. law, something a court could probably decide. However, the case gets thrown out because his father does not have the legal standing to bring that case in a court of law in the United States. According to the court, only Awlaki himself can actually file the lawsuit to get himself off the list. And of course, filing that lawsuit would require him to come back to the United States to file said lawsuit, which he is not willing to do. He is convinced that if he ever tries to come back to the United States, he'll never see the light of day again. So he has made his peace. He is living on the run. He knows he's being stalked. On a number of occasions, he is almost killed by American remotely piloted aircraft. In one case, on May 5th of 2011, a Predator fired a missile at what we thought was a vehicle carrying Awlaki. It turns out he had swapped vehicles with a couple of Al-Qaeda operatives and he managed to escape. But on the 14th of October, 2011, Anwar al-Awlaki and another American, Samir Khan, shown here, were killed by a Predator firing a Hellfire missile. And to a certain extent, I'm okay with that. I'm not sad that he's not part of this earth anymore. However, the precedent for it has me a little bit nervous. Because, at least in theory, Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution defines treason. Was Awlaki guilty of treason? I would say that he was. Was he given a trial to prove that fact? No, he was not. In fact, the executive branch made the decision that they would execute him at the first opportunity, regardless of his citizenship status. It would have been harder to get permission to place a wiretap on Awlaki's cell phone than it was to put him on the kill list. Because the wiretap at least would have required oversight from the FISA court, and in Awlaki's case, being put on the list did not. Moving further into the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment tells us you cannot be held to answer for a capital crime without an indictment of a grand jury and without having the opportunity for a trial. And the Sixth Amendment says that trial needs to be speedy, it needs to be public, you are allowed to confront the witnesses against you, and you have the right to the assistance of counsel. None of these things were true in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki. And again, I understand, in wartime there is a gray area, and killing him probably saved American lives. But there's a kicker to the Awlaki story, and that is his teenage son, Abdul Rahman. Now, Abdul Rahman had not seen his father in more than 5 years. He's living in Yemen with his grandparents, and he hears a rumor of where his father might be. And so being a teenager, he's 16 years old, he's impulsive. He decides he's going to run away from home, he's going to hop on a bus, and he's going to go to this town where he's heard his father is living, and he's going to find his dad. What he doesn't know is that his father had been killed 2 weeks before. And he was not even in the town the kid thought that his father was in. So he heads off. Now his grandparents wake up, and he's kindly left them a note that says, I've gone off to find my father, this is where I'm going, I'm really sorry, but I have to do this. And they call ahead to the town that the kid is headed to, where they have some relatives, and they say, look, Abdul Rahman has got it in his head that he's going to come look for his father. Could you pick him up at the bus station, hold on to him for a few days, we'll come pick him up in a few days, got to get off from work, et cetera, et cetera. So he spends a few days meeting his distant cousins, wandering around the town. And on the last day before he's supposed to board a bus and go back home to his grandparents, he's sitting in a coffee shop with 6 other teenagers when a Hellfire missile strikes and kills them all. It strikes with such force and such power that the family is not able to distinguish the remains, and they wind up having to bury all 7 of them in a common grave. Now, as you might imagine, the family protests this action and asks, why did you kill our grandson? And the federal response was, this man was a 21-year-old Al-Qaeda operative who was actively planning operations against the United States. To which the family said, no, he wasn't. He was a teenager, 16 years old, born in Denver. He wasn't an Al-Qaeda operative. Look at his Facebook profile. The kid is showing all these pictures of all his life. He's not in any way, shape, or form radicalized. You killed him because of who his father was. And the government came back and said, well, actually, we didn't kill him. We killed the guy next to him, and he just happened to be sitting next to the wrong person. Because we were actually aiming at the bomb maker from Egypt that was sitting next to him. So, you sit around next to bad people, and sometimes bad things happen. The problem is the CIA had that bomb maker under surveillance at the same time, and he was in Egypt. He wasn't in Yemen. Now, the government has not commented since on this particular case, and I don't think they will, because there's not really anything good you can say about this particular incident. But it's indicative of a lot of our decision-making in the 21st century. Military robotics have made us feel like we can wage war with impunity, that we can fight a war without facing the possibility of taking casualties on our own. And it has eroded the normal standards for when we use conflict as opposed to other mechanisms of coercion and influence. Military robotics are making us more likely to go to war. But they don't mean that we can fight wars with impunity. And the reason why is the enemy doesn't simply sit there and take the punishment rained down from robots in the skies. They can't shoot down those robots, and even if they could, it wouldn't be very satisfying. Instead, they look for other targets that they can reach. But those targets don't tend to be uniformed personnel who have adopted the risk, who have accepted it as part of service. Rather, the organizations that we're targeting with these devices tend to aim for civilians, whether it be embassy personnel or tourists that just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They strike back by placing bombs on civilian airliners, by leaving car bombs in crowded areas. They don't just absorb the punishment, and they're not going to follow the rules. So my argument is not that we should give up military robotics, that we should stop this. That's not going to happen. Technological progress will continue. But we do need to think about where it is we're trying to go and what it is we're trying to produce, lest we choose the worst possible scenario. Thank you for your kind attention. I appreciate the opportunity. And I believe if you would like to ask a question, there are microphones on the side so that they can record you and remember exactly who you are forever.
How much has the robotics war, cyber war, been responsible for the destruction of ISIS and Al-Qaeda? Both of those terrorist groups have certainly retreated a great deal.
It's a judgment call, whether they've retreated or whether they've metastasized and spread, because Al-Qaeda has a lot more franchises now than it did in 2001. Now, that may be because its sanctuaries have been destroyed. Very difficult for Al-Qaeda to group large formations in Afghanistan or Iraq or, quite frankly, anywhere. But both of those organizations have also received the allegiance of a lot of very terrifying groups. Most people don't realize the deadliest terror organization of the last 10 years is actually Boko Haram, based in Nigeria. Boko Haram has sworn its allegiance to the Islamic State. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, one of the deadliest organizations, has sworn its allegiance to Al-Qaeda and now is being swayed towards the Islamic State. So it's a judgment call whether this has really eroded their abilities, whether this has hindered their opportunity to engage in operations or not. A lot of what we're doing against the Islamic State now is actually manned aircraft strikes because we're launching so many of them and they can carry so many munitions. But I would argue that while geographically the Islamic State has been pushed back a little bit, in terms of the number of casualties they're inflicting, they're still an incredibly dangerous, deadly organization. So I'm not sure that this is really eroding their power at all.
Thank you.
Do you think the Russians were in violation of the rules of war in the Ukraine with the troops they sent in with basically un-Russian uniforms?
Yes, the so-called Russian volunteers, if you will, these patriotic Russians, I would argue that that's a violation of the laws of war, that Russia was openly engaged in an invasion of portions of sovereign Ukrainian territory. And that's something the Russians have done recently. So take, for example, the case of Georgia in 2008, where the Russians effectively said there's an ethnic majority of Russians in South Ossetia, and we have a responsibility to protect them from the evil overlord Georgian government. In the Ukraine, it was the same argument. These people are ethnically Russian, they're historically Russian, they speak Russian, and the Ukrainian government is mistreating them, therefore we have a legal right to invade. According to the UN Charter, they don't. They don't have a right to invade, but they do have a veto, which means if the UN wanted to try to pass some kind of a Security Council resolution to condemn or even to send forces, the Russians could veto it. They have the legal right, and they're not required to explain their veto, and there's no real mechanism to override that veto. So is it legal for you to infiltrate forces out of uniform onto sovereign territory to engage in warfare? No, it's not. Does that mean the international community will actually do anything about it? I seriously doubt it, because trying to intervene that close to Russia, that far from our supply bases, while we're engaged in so many other conflicts, is a really difficult proposition. And without American leadership, the rest of the world's not going to do it.
I was wondering, when artificial intelligence is mature enough and it's integrated with robots and they're sent into war, what do you think is a realistic contingency plan as a kill button to terminate them?
So when our enemies use robots against us, what should we do? Is that what you're...
No, just when they go out of control, like in the movies.
Ah, yeah. It's fair. I don't know, hide in your basement, surrender. No, in theory, you can program robots to have a kill switch to shut down. In theory, you could use something like an electromagnetic pulse maybe to fry their electronics, but you can shield against those things too. If you design killer robots, for lack of a better term, and you make them powerful enough to engage in war, shutting them down if you've made a programming error could be a really bloody proposition. The last thing that I want to see is a fight between humans and robots. And that means even if it's our robots and humans we don't like, I think that's a really bad idea. But here's a little tidbit for you. The United States Army right now is capped at 480,000 human troops. There's no limit to how many robots it can have. You could build 1 million, you could build 2 million of those tracked robots and send those into conflict. And a lot of Americans would say, oh, well, as long as no American troops die, it's no big deal what happens. I mean, we never value somebody else's life as much as we do our own. So, the allure of, oh, wow, I can fight a war and not lose any of my own citizenry could prove almost irresistible to some people unless you educate them on the ramifications of it. I don't have a good answer for how to stop them, other than maybe try to stop people from building them in the first place would be good.
Thanks.
A lot of what I know about robotics in the military comes from the film Eye in the Sky. How much of that was realistic, and how much of the political aspect of the ability to cordon off an area because there was a single civilian that you didn't want to kill, how much of that would be realistic as well?
It's been a long time since I've even come into passing with it, but you can program an entire area to be completely off limits. We've done that plenty of times before. We do that right now. So we have areas that are considered, for lack of a better term, kill boxes, and areas that are considered completely off limits now, whether it be humans or robotics. And if you wanted to cordon off an area, you certainly could. Hollywood does not care to be particularly accurate when they're depicting robots, especially robots of war, because the reality is far less exciting in some ways and far more terrifying in others, depending on how deeply you think about it. So I wouldn't rely on Hollywood too much to get the story exactly right. These are the same people that will still have you watch a crime show and they say, oh, keep the villain on the line for 30 seconds so we can trace them. A telephone trace takes less than a second. That's why 9/11 knows exactly where you are when you call them. It's a Hollywood device that works pretty well, and so it becomes kind of a Hollywood trope. Hollywood has depicted so many robots now that I think a lot of people are thinking, well, it won't be that bad. I mean, they'll be cute and cuddly, and this new Star Wars movie has the little one that rolls around and everybody likes him. He's a lot of fun and not at all scary. Unless you put some C4 on him, in which case he's a rolling bomb. Now, that might seem far-fetched, except American troops did that with a robot that looked like it was built out of somebody's erector set. They stuck a Claymore mine on the front of what's called a MarkBot. It weighs about 8 pounds. It's about this big. And they put a Claymore mine on it and sent it forward and basically said, well, if any of these guys that we're fighting against come out of the shadows, we're just going to detonate this rolling landmine. People are capable of some really horrific innovations. In that case, they didn't wind up using it, but I definitely wouldn't rely on Hollywood probably to give you the best idea of what's going on out there. Sir?
Oh, thank you. We've heard stories, I guess, of teleoperators who are in the military or under military control and have the uniform on. We've also heard stories about civilians and CIA and intelligence officers who push the kill button on those drones too. And I'm not sure if that's quite under the laws of war.
Well, so we have what's called Title 10, which is the U.S. code that governs all military operations and all things military. I am a Title 10 employee. I work for the United States Air Force. Title 50 governs the intelligence services. And back in the 1970s, President Gerald Ford essentially issued what's been referred to as the assassination ban. He effectively said members of intelligence agencies are not allowed to kill people, and in particular are not allowed to assassinate people. Why? Well, very publicly we'd been caught doing it a couple times, and we'd also tried and failed a bunch of times to kill Fidel Castro. I mean, it's like watching a Wile E. Coyote cartoon. Some of the things, exploding cigars, seriously, we tried that. In one particular case, we actually laced his scuba suit with LSD, a whole bunch of LSD, so that he'd put it on and it would poison him. A different person put it on, in case you're wondering. So Gerald Ford says, okay, no more assassinations. That's bad. And every president renewed that until the 1990s, when President Clinton created an exception for individuals who were leaders in foreign terrorist organizations as designated by the State Department. So effectively, President Clinton said, all right, the ban means you can't kill foreign heads of state, but it's okay for intelligence officers to target Al-Qaeda or other groups that we have said, you're terrorists and we don't like you and we're going to put you on this list and give you fair warning. So, when it comes to remotely piloted aircraft, things like Predators, things like Reapers, the vast majority of strikes by those aircraft, particularly outside of Afghanistan and Iraq, have not been carried out by uniformed U.S. Air Force personnel. Some have been carried out by CIA. A lot have been carried out by contractors working for the CIA. And what that does is it effectively creates sort of a cutout. It divorces you further and further away from the rules, and it makes it easier. The intelligence agencies are a lot better at kind of hiding exactly what they're doing. and exactly who's responsible for the decision to kill, the decision to strike, etc., it becomes harder and harder to untangle who's responsible if you make a mistake. Is it against the laws of war? It's a gray area. You could conceive of those individuals as mercenaries, which have fallen completely out of favor in international law. You could also conceive of them as agents of the United States government, in which case they would theoretically be protected. So I can't give you a good answer because I don't think there is a good answer. But if there is, it will be devised by someone far smarter than me.
Thank you.
The two practical two practical things that are stopping the expansion, in my understanding of robotics now, would I think be budget, seeing as how things like Predator drones cost millions of dollars, and also just the fact that there's only so many people that can create these. You don't seem to think that that's really going to stop this from becoming the dominant form of warfare. I'd like to know why.
First of all, the United States has always been willing to spend money more than blood. That's our thing, especially since World War II. But even in World War II, one of the adages that the Germans would say was, you can't fight against the Americans because they fire 10 times as much artillery as they need. And it's because the United States was willing to substitute firepower for human power. And this is just an extension of that. So you're right, a Predator costs a lot of money, although most of the cost of a Predator is the sensor ball. It's not the airframe itself, which runs a couple of $1 million. It's all the stuff you strap onto it that gets more expensive. But it turns out an American infantry person is also incredibly expensive. Not only do you have to pay them a salary every year, but you spend more than $250,000 just training them to be able to do their basic job, and then you spend another $250,000 outfitting them with stuff. And then, should they become any kind of a casualty, you might spend millions of dollars on their medical care, millions of dollars on their veterans' benefits. In terms of a cost-benefit analysis, the nice thing about the machines are you can mass produce them and you can stockpile them. You can just have them sitting around until you want to engage in a conflict. That's a lot harder to do with human beings. You have to create this force in being. There's also the attractiveness, if you're a civilian decision maker and you say, I want you to go do X, there's always the possibility that a human will say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's an unethical order, that's an illegal order, that's an immoral order. Robots don't talk back. They just do what they're told. And that can make them very, very attractive if you want to be a really controlling leader. Right now, as you know, thanks to the Constitution, the military is subordinate to civilian control. And that can cause frustration sometimes. Sometimes the military feels like they're not being listened to. They're the experts, but the civilians want to tell them how to do things. But there haven't really been any instances in American history where the military flat out refused to do what was asked of them in terms of military missions. There have been plenty of times on non-military missions that they've effectively said, yeah, that's not our thing, we can't do that. But robots don't talk back. And so while there might be a large initial investment, that investment, once it's a sunk cost, they cost almost nothing to operate. You have to replace their munitions, you have to give them a battery charge every once in a while, and that's pretty much it. And what we're seeing is these things are becoming more and more attractive. So if you go to the North Korean-South Korean border, for example, the South Koreans have started to build and deploy sentry robots. Now, one of the attractive sides of this is, you don't have to have personnel patrolling. You can have a robot that has senses in a lot more ways. It can see in the infrared spectrum, it can see in the UV spectrum, and so on and so forth. But one of the other attractive aspects of it, and this is something that makes me feel good, your sentry robots don't necessarily have to use lethal force. You're willing to risk a robot. So you can arm the robot with a taser or with tear gas, and that might actually allow you to save lives on both sides. That's not necessarily what those sentry robots are armed with. I mean, that's a hostile border. It's been at war for 60 years. But in terms of why I see this happening, I don't think cost is going to be what stops us. I mean, we're $20 trillion in debt. We seem to be comfortable with racking that up. So, we just passed a $602 billion defense budget. And compared to that, I mean, we're talking about a few $1 billion that are being spent on robots right now. So right now, I think they're going to wind up becoming the more cost-effective option. Ma'am.
Yes. What, in your view, would constitute an act of war in cyberspace? And where would the issue of sovereignty come in?
That's a good question. I'm going to stall real quick. We'll stall some more. Hey, time's up. Have a great night. So generally, the threshold for an act of war is in the recipient's eyes. All right? If Canada launches a border incursion, and let's be honest, 90% of the Canadian population lives within about 50 miles of the border, they're poised to attack. If a couple of Canadian hunters wander across the border and they're shooting at a deer, but they shoot my cousin instead, that's not an act of war, it's just an accident. Unless the U.S. government is really looking for an opportunity to pick a fight with Canada, in which case we might make a big deal about it. When it comes to a cyber incursion, what the U.S. government has said, or at least what Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said, and Leon Panetta then echoed, was the U.S. reserves the right to retaliate for any kind of a cyber attack. And we don't say that we will restrict ourselves to the cyber domain. So we're effectively saying if you do anything in cyber that we could plausibly call an act of war, then if we think it's to our advantage, we'll call it an act of war. Now for me, an act of war needs to either cause casualties or significant property damage, and it needs to be done with that purpose. It can't be an accidental, gosh, I was trying to engage in espionage and I accidentally shut down a power grid and some people died in car accidents. That's not an act of war, that's an act of espionage or an act of sabotage that I wouldn't classify the same way. But it turns out it's not up to me. And depending on who we thought launched that attack, we might very well classify it as an act of war so that we would have the opportunity for a retaliation if we thought that served our national interests. Now, in the cyber domain, one of the hardest things to do is attribution. How do you even figure out who did this to you? If I pull out a gun and I shoot Alan Luxembourg, the rest of you are going to know that I did it because it was right in front of you. But if I pull out my phone and launch some kind of a cyber attack that shuts down his systems, for all you know, I was sending a text to my wife. And so in the cyber realm, this gray area of what is or is not an act of war is incredibly hard to decipher. And right now, we don't have a good answer. But like every other form of potential conflict, it's the aggrieved nation that tends to make its own decision about whether it wants to go to war or not. In 2007, when the Russians unleashed their cyber militias against Estonia, they effectively shut down the entire Estonian cyber system. And if you don't know, Estonia is the most wired system, the most wired country on Earth. For all intents and purposes, Estonia is a cashless society. Every transaction is done electronically. And the Russians shut down their entire internet for the whole country for 3 weeks over a really tiny political issue. Essentially, the Estonians offended Russia by trying to move a statue of a patriotic Russian soldier. They wanted to move it away from the city center into a garden, and the Russians got angry. Was that an act of war for them to shut down the entire Estonian economy, to shut down the Estonian power grid, to shut down the Estonian banking industry? You could definitely call that an act of war. It was incredibly damaging. But if you're Estonia, tiny Estonia, population 3 million, do you really want to pick a fight with your Russian neighbor? And what are you going to do in response? A cyber retaliation wouldn't work. The Russians were too good at cyber and they knew the attack was coming. And so what did the Estonians do? They apologized and put the statue back and waited for it to be over. Was it an act of war? Yeah, probably. Did NATO define it as an act of war? No, because NATO said, well, we really don't want to get involved in this. You know, we're not going to go to fighting over a 9-foot bronze statue. You've got to be kidding me. So I'm not sure there is a clearly defined threshold yet.
Got it. Thank you.
My father experienced the effects of remote control glider bombers in Italy at Salerno. And he was a casualty also there. But he had said that if the Germans had continued with that offensive, they would have pushed us into the sea and changed the whole outcome of the war. Now, why didn't we work on something also during the Second World War? We were more content, content on using infantrymen. My father was in the infantry over there in Salerno, and why didn't we work on that? Well, we worked on the atomic bomb.
Well, sure, we worked on the atomic bomb, and we pick and choose which technologies we want to pursue. So one of the technologies that we were pursuing that cost almost as much as the atomic bomb was, of course, the B-29 that was going to deliver it. So a lot of our top scientists and engineers were going into projects like that, or going into the proximity fuse. This was a system that allowed an artillery shell to explode when it got near a metallic target. Made for phenomenally effective air defense systems, but it absolutely terrified us that the enemy might get a hold of it. So we got a hold of some of their glide bombs, and we started to reverse engineer them. But part of the problem was these things were jet engines. And the Germans were so far ahead of us in terms of jet technology that even as you try to reverse engineer it and you try to bring out your copies of it as fast as you can, the enemy had a significant head start. They'd done all the experiments for how do you actually control jet engines and how do you produce them effectively. So we did take the captured technology and start trying to produce our own copies of it. And as you might know, at the end of the war, we captured as many German scientists and engineers as we could and brought them to the United States and put them into our high technology programs. So at Huntsville, Alabama, for example, we built an enormous rocket program that's centered entirely around German rocket scientists that had fled west as fast as they could to surrender to the Western Allies rather than surrendering to the Soviets that were coming in. We worked on it, but we were far enough behind that we didn't prioritize it because we were prioritizing other things that we thought would win the war. And sometimes that meant we had to put up with the enemy having an advantage over us. I mean, that's the danger when you face a technologically advanced opponent.
Thank you.
Hello. You mentioned earlier the EMP, electromagnetic pulse, and hardening individual robots. I'd love you to comment about how hardened we are at a micro level in terms of individual predator drones, things like that, and which, of course, is wonderful and protects us completely against ISIS and people like that trying to do something electronically. And on more of a macro strategic level, how our increasing dependence upon computer-driven defense and offense is in fact hardened against a more robust electronic enemy, say a Russia or a China.
Sure. So hardening is possible, but it's pretty expensive, which means we don't typically do it, especially if we're facing an enemy that doesn't really have the capacity to do anything about it. The Islamic State, for all intents and purposes, doesn't have any air defenses, doesn't have any cyber capability, so we haven't really had to harden against them. Now, when it comes to a predator, the life expectancy of a predator, if you wanted to fly it against a peer competitor like China or Russia, probably measured in seconds. Shooting one down wouldn't be difficult. It cruises at about 100 miles an hour. Its radar cross-section's pretty obvious. I mean, we're not trying to hide what the thing is. Right now, we use it with impunity because the enemy can't do anything about it. Our most experience with hardening against electromagnetic radiation is really in the space program. Because space is a really harsh environment, and satellites in particular have had to be hardened against things. The sun has a bad habit of emitting all kinds of radiation that's really damaging. And so we've had to learn how to protect these components long term. So we know how to do it, more or less. But again, it's expensive. It weighs down whatever it is you're trying to harden. So if you want to have a loiter time of 24 hours with a predator, you really can't harden its electronics right now. Now, one of the things that we face that we fear is when you remotely control something, that means by definition somebody else could, at least in theory, take control. There was a case a few years ago where a Sentinel, an RQ-170 Sentinel, was flying over Iran, and for some reason it landed on an Iranian highway. And the Iranians said, aha, see, we took over your aircraft. Ha-ha, we're these great hackers. No, they didn't. What they did was they basically broadcast a GPS signal at a stronger wattage than the one that's normally broadcast from satellites. They overwhelmed its GPS receiver and convinced it was somewhere that it wasn't. And so they basically told it, hey, you're right over the airfield where you're supposed to land, and it went, okay, I guess I should land. That's not taking over, but that was a really clever way to bring it down. And the Iranians proved to be incapable of reverse engineering the thing. That doesn't mean that the Chinese and the Russians are incapable of reverse engineering it should the Iranians choose to sell components from it. So, every time you create these devices that are remotely controlled, you run the risk of somebody else remotely controlling it against your wishes. And that's one of the things that's pushing us towards autonomy. After all, if the machine controls itself, then it's not as susceptible to external control. Unfortunately, that means your own external control as well. And so when it comes to things like EMP, setting off an EMP pulse without a nuclear detonation is not particularly easy right now. There have been some laboratory experiments that show that it could theoretically be done, but this is another one of those cases where Hollywood makes it seem like, oh, it's real simple. You just snap your fingers and knock out the electronics of an entire city. And it's definitely not like that. Jamming is actually a much bigger problem for us now than some kind of a pulse to knock out the whole system.
Well,
I think this is the final question,
Yeah.
so make it a really good one.
Okay, well, robotic weapons systems have had domestic popular support because we, the good guys, are using them on them, the bad guys. It's not going to be very pretty for us when the tables are turned, which isn't long off. Do you know of any diplomatic initiatives or thoughts about making them ban WMDs like chemical, nuclear, and biologic?
Okay, so we have a number of treaties that cover things like the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention. Those are both cases where you said, you know what, there are some horrible things in the world that you should not use in war. And we all collectively said these are really, really bad. Now, there are regimes, for example, the Syrian regime was recently accused of using chemical weapons. It looks like they almost certainly used sarin gas. So there are people that will violate the rules. The nuclear weapons situation, in theory, there is a nuclear non-proliferation treaty in place that, in theory, means no other nations are going to start and develop nuclear weapons programs. In practice, we've seen that's not true. There are non-signatories to it that have chosen to develop their own systems, and there are signatories to it that have chosen to ignore its provisions. There is a social movement to ban autonomous weapons. There has not been a significant push in the international legal arena yet. So there are a lot of individual scholars, individual theorists saying, you know, we could probably save a lot of trouble if we just ban these horrible things before you use them. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the way that humans work very well. The chemical weapons ban, for example, only came about after World War I, when we saw how horrible chemical weapons were and how undecisive they were. They didn't win the war, they just made it worse for everybody involved. And in some ways, that's how I see autonomous weapons going. They're not going to win the war unless you're facing an opponent that you could have beaten without them. What they're going to do is they're going to make war worse. Because let's just say, hypothetically, we get into a war with a peer competitor that is also using military robotics. And let's assume that our robots destroy theirs. Is that country going to surrender now that its robotic guardians are gone? Human history says no, they won't. Human history says no, they'll keep fighting. Particularly if we're talking about a war of conquest rather than a limited fight. And in that particular case, now your robots are going to have to deploy against their human troops. And they're probably going to be very, very effective at killing them. But humans will fight a lot longer than hindsight would indicate was a practical idea, particularly in wars of national survival. And what I foresee, again, because I'm a pessimist, is that you build enough of these machines, you're going to feel almost a compulsion to use them before somebody else gets a better advantage over you. And you're going to wind up using these things, and you may create one of the worst human atrocities in history without actually changing the nature of state interaction in the world today. So that's a happy note.
Well, on behalf of the New York Historical Society and the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I want to thank Paul Springer for sharing with us remarks that offer clarity and judiciousness in approaching very complex technical issues we face today as a country and in the world. I thank all of you for joining us, and there's a lot of things going on here at the Society. Come back often. Thank you very much. Great.
Well, at least the timing was right. So.
All right, thank you, everyone.